A man on a forest patrol, a rusted cage hidden deep among the old pines. Inside, a foal barely clinging to life. But he had no idea someone was watching him from the shadows. And when he opened the cage, the unthinkable happened. A wild Mustang mare stepped out from the trees. She didn't flee, she didn't fight. She simply stood there, entrusting her dying child to him, as if it were her final plea. The late autumn wind swept down the Cascade Range like a cold stream, cutting across the mountains, carrying the scent of decaying leaves, pine resin, and impending snow. Ethan Calloway pulled up the collar of his thick jacket, his left hand gripping the wheel of a weathered silver-gray pickup truck. The morning light filtered dimly through pockets of fog, catching the dust on the windshield and scattering it in a soft shimmer across the frame. No alarms, no emergency calls. Just another Friday morning, if by normal, one meant a lone man driving miles of rough terrain to check the GPS collars on a herd of deer the Rock Pines Wildlife Rescue Team had been tracking. Ethan called these trips purposeful wandering. He didn't put much faith in maps. Out here, on the fringe of the forest, the best compass was still your eyes, your ears, and that low tug in your chest, the one that told you when the land itself was whispering for you to come. He had left Portland 7 years ago, after a family tragedy and a resignation from the robotics firm that once defined his career. No one really understood why a brilliant mechanical engineer would walk away from the cutting edge of technology to live in near solitude in the woods. But Ethan had never felt the need to explain. Nature never asked why. The truck jolted slightly as he downshifted, climbing over a moss-covered outcrop. The deer herd had gone silent for days after moving into the eastern digital fence zone. Ethan veered onto a path barely wider than the truck's tires, an unmarked trail thick with cedar branches and ferns turning brown at the edges. He had planned to check the signal transmitter near the ridge, but a faint glint off to the right side of the road made him slam the brakes. Something was reflecting light, not rock, not water. It sat deep in the brush, half obscured by lashing branches. Ethan shut off the engine, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped into the chill. The cold air stung his face, the wind whispering through the towering trees. He moved slowly, like someone stepping onto thin ice, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over trunks and stones. When he parted the waist-high grass, he saw it. A crude, rusted cage. Homemade, jagged. Too small for anything to survive inside without injury. Ethan held his breath. Behind the bent iron bars was a tiny form, curled into a shivering, muddy heap. A foal. No more than 2 weeks old. So small he'd first mistaken it for a lost fawn. But the tangled mane, the raw scrapes along its side, and those spindly legs told him this was a Mustang, an animal born to run with the wind, not to cower in a blood-stained cage in the wilderness. His heart pounded. He dropped to one knee, the flashlight casting a harsh glow over the fragile ribcage rising and falling in shallow gasps. The foal didn't whinny. It simply stared, wide, terrified brown eyes fixed on him through the bars. No sound, just pure, silent fear from a creature standing alone on the edge of death. "Hey there, baby," Ethan whispered, backing off slightly. He touched the cage, cold, sharp, reeking of rust and blood. The wires had been twisted hastily, carelessly. Whoever had set this trap hadn't cared about pain, they just wanted something to sell. He turned and sprinted to the truck, rifling through the toolbox for bolt cutters and a headlamp. Back at the cage, he worked deliberately, cutting one wire at a time. The metal screamed with each snip, tearing the morning stillness into jagged uncertainty. When the last strand gave way, Ethan didn't open the door. He sat down beside it, the beam of his headlamp angled away, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." But then, another sound. Not wind. Not leaves. A breath. Long, deep, heavy. Ethan froze. Goosebumps raced up his neck. He turned slowly and met the eyes of a wild creature that had never backed down. A full-grown Mustang mare. Standing 30 meters away, half concealed behind dense brush, her coat gleamed bronze in the early sun. Her black mane whipped in the wind. Her chest rose and fell, not with panic or aggression, but with something deeper, contained. Fierce, her gaze dark, burning, dry, locked onto his. Ethan took a half step back, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It took him several seconds to realize he was holding his breath. This was the foal's mother, and she had been there the whole time. No charge, no retreat, no sound, She stood like a statue, watching him like a verdict waiting to be delivered. And for the first time in 7 years of rescue work, Ethan Calloway didn't know what to do next. No one moved. No sound but the dry rustle of leaves above, stirred by a passing breeze, and the pounding of Ethan's heart in his chest. He remained where he was, just 2 steps from the cage he had just unbound, his eyes locked on the wild creature at the edge of the trees. The mare didn't snort, didn't paw the earth, didn't flinch. She stood there, not quite attacking, not quite retreating. Her entire body coiled like a drawn bowstring, but instead of launching, it simply held. Her black, burning eyes didn't blink. No fear, no rage. Just something else. She was analyzing, assessing, calculating. Ethan didn't dare raise his voice. He only whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear. A reminder more than anything. Easy now. Don't scare her. Each minute stretched out like hours. The foal inside the cage still didn't move, its head tilted slightly toward the familiar sound. And then, like a flicker of hope, it let out a tiny strained whinny, raspy and weak, like its throat had dried out days ago. But it was a call. Ethan couldn't quite see the change in the mare's eyes, but he felt it, as if the sound had unlocked something deep inside her. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, the brittle crunch of her hooves pressing into gravel and leaves. One step. Then another. She moved, not as a creature driven by fear, but as one crossing a line between the wild and the human world. Ethan swallowed. He didn't move but lowered his hand slowly, palm open and facing up, a gesture as ancient as fire. I carry no weapon, I mean no harm. She stopped about 20 feet away. That's when Ethan noticed. Her breathing was uneven, her body trembling slightly. Not out of fear, but because she was fighting it. The instinct to bolt. The instinct to defend her baby with teeth and hooves. But she didn't choose that path. Ethan turned his head just enough to glance at the foal, still lying down, but its legs were starting to twitch. It tried to roll, to shift, to rise on its front legs with the awkward wobble of a creature that had never known balance. He thought to himself, "Come on, little one, just stand." The foal staggered upright, its fragile frame trembling, but miraculously, it didn't fall. And then, in that instant, it turned its head toward its mother. A small whinny escaped its dry throat. The mare responded instantly, with a deeper, fuller sound, overflowing with something primal and raw. A mother's sound. No one taught them this. No language was needed. Between mother and child, there was a signal older than time, stronger than pain. Ethan dared not breathe, afraid even a blink might shatter the moment. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of rushing to her foal, the mare walked toward Ethan. His heart hammered, his throat closed. No one had ever taught him what to do when a wild horse, a mother, no less, chose to close the distance. She stopped just 2 steps away, ears slightly turned out, eyes still locked onto his. Then, she turned her head to look at her foal and back to Ethan as if asking a question he couldn't quite hear. Now what? The foal wobbled toward her, front legs buckling but pushing on. It made it to her side, nuzzling against her ribcage. She lowered her head, touching her muzzle to its shoulder, gently, trembling, a whisper that said, "I'm here." Ethan swallowed back the wave rising in his chest. He had never witnessed something so sacred. But what came next was even stranger. The mare looked at him again, this time longer. Then she took one more step. Ethan didn't understand why he didn't back away. Maybe because her eyes held no threat, only a quiet surrender, a decision. Something he'd never believed a wild creature could offer a human. He spoke softly, barely audible. "I don't know what I'm doing, but if you're choosing to trust me, I won't let you down." The mare blinked, slow, deliberate, and lowered her head until her muzzle hovered near his chest. Ethan sat down. For the first time they were eye level. Mother and child, a wild being born to the forest, stood beside a man who had walked away from the modern world in search of something he hadn't yet named. And maybe, in that moment, he had found it. Ethan Calloway cradled the foal in both arms, holding him as gently as one might hold a newborn child, careful not to let the colt's fragile limbs strain under their own weight. The little Mustang let out a soft whimper, resting his head against Ethan's shoulder, his whole body warm and limp like an old flannel blanket. He was too weak to struggle, too exhausted to resist. And maybe, just maybe, he trusted enough to surrender. "You did good, buddy," Ethan whispered against the foal's ear. He opened the truck bed and gently laid the colt down onto a pile of worn towels and soft blankets, kept ready for emergency rescues. The colt's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, each breath rasping like a tired whisper. Ethan turned around. The mare, who now in his mind bore the name Maple, stood just beyond the clearing, her head lowered, her eyes locked on her baby. Something in her stance made Ethan pause. He took a step toward her. Maple didn't bolt. But when he was just a few paces away, she backed up, only slightly. Not out of fear, but with the quiet control of one who was setting a boundary. Like she was saying, "Okay, but the rest? That's still up to me." Ethan nodded. That line was the last thing she had left from the wild. When he started the engine, Maple didn't look away. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, then slowly pulled away from the clearing. He didn't dare drive fast. The path was rough with stone and slick mud, and the truck bounced unevenly as it wound through the trees. Then, through the mirror, he saw her move. No panic, no frenzy. She followed. Step by step, she kept pace. Sometimes at a slow trot, sometimes at a canter, but never letting the distance grow too far. As if tethered not by a rope, but by a mother's instinct. The road back to Rock Pine Sanctuary was nearly 10 miles of winding forest trails, dry creek beds, blind curves, and narrow cliffs. But Maple stayed close, as if she had been born to walk that very road. Ethan checked the mirror every minute, and every time he saw her there, silent, strong, unwavering. By the time they reached the gates, dusk had begun to settle. Rock Pines wasn't a large facility, just a small rescue run by Ethan and a handful of volunteers specializing in injured wildlife. Deer, owls, sometimes even orphaned bear cubs. 2 staff members were on duty that day. Lily, a young ecology student interning through the fall, and Wade, a retired Marine who now worked night shifts and fixed fencing when needed. Ethan slammed the brakes in front of the gate and jumped out. "Wade, Lily, out here, a second!" he called, not shouting, but loud enough to summon them from the cabin. Wade appeared first, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on?" "We've got a special case," Ethan said, swinging open the truck bed. Wade furrowed his brow, but when he saw the foal lying there, his eyes widened. "Holy hell, what the?" "Found him caged in the woods. Not an accident. The trap was deliberate. Could be poachers, or worse, illegal horse runners." Lily peered inside. Is he alive?" "Barely." Ethan gently laid another blanket over the foal, Oakley. The name had come to him suddenly, like a whisper from the oak groves they'd passed that morning. "His name's Oakley." Wade squinted. "And the mother? Did you see her?" "Yeah," Ethan said, and his heart skipped. Maple was standing just beyond the fence line. No rope, no halter, no lead. She had followed them 10 miles, across wild terrain, to arrive here and wait. Just wait. Lily's mouth fell open. "Oh my God, she followed you?" Ethan nodded. Wade took a step back. "You realize this is nuts, right? She's a wild Mustang, a mother. She should be guarding her baby or running from us." "I know, Wade. So what now? You gonna just let her into the sanctuary?" "No. If she wants to come in, she'll come in herself." Ethan looked toward Maple. "I won't lead her." They opened the gate. No one called, no one gestured. Maple looked at the gate slowly opening in front of her, then stepped forward. No hesitation, no prompting. She walked straight across the gravel, headed directly to the small barn where Ethan had taken Oakley, and stopped right in front of the door. Ethan had never seen anything like it. She stood sentinel, like a statue brought to life. No eating, no sleeping, no pacing, no sound. All through the night, as Oakley was given fluids, wrapped in blankets, and placed under gentle heat lamps, Maple never looked away. Every time Oakley stirred, she stepped forward. When he lay still, she returned to her position, ears alert. Lily whispered, "I've never seen maternal instinct that clear before." Ethan only nodded. No words were enough. No science could explain it. This wasn't just instinct. This was a choice. The next morning, as sunlight peeked through the eastern ridges, Ethan stepped out of the cabin, steaming coffee in hand. He looked toward the barn. Maple was still there. And inside, Oakley was sleeping peacefully. The early morning fog still clung to the ground like a thin blanket draped over damp grasses. The sun hadn't fully risen past the eastern ridge, but golden light already crept across the sanctuary yard, glinting off the hazy window panes of the isolation barn, where Oakley lay beneath the soft warmth of a heat lamp. Ethan moved slowly along the wooden walkway, carrying a small plastic tub filled with pre-mixed formula and a rubber feeding syringe. For 3 days straight, he, Lily, and Wade had taken shifts around the clock to monitor Oakley's condition. The foal had survived the initial danger, but hunger, dehydration, and untreated wounds meant any small setback could still be fatal. Maple remained outside the stall. 3 days now, without touching a single blade of grass, without drinking from the water trough nearby, without wandering more than a few steps. She stood like a stone guardian, existing only for another's life, not her own. Ethan quietly set the tub down, opened the stall door, and sat beside Oakley. The foal stirred slightly at his presence, but no longer startled. His body trembled less now, his eyes more focused, and he even flicked his tail from time to time like a playful pup. "Good morning, kid," Ethan whispered, gently easing the syringe toward Oakley's mouth. Maple stretched her neck to see, ears perked as if ensuring nothing would harm her baby. She didn't move when Ethan approached, only watched, her gaze still as piercing and deep as that morning at the forest's edge. When Oakley finished and curled up to rest again, Ethan stepped outside. He picked up a fresh bucket of water and approached Maple slowly. But then, something strange caught his eye. As he bent down, he noticed a faint discoloration beneath the long strands of mane on the left side of her neck. He straightened. The mark wasn't obvious, partially hidden by her thick winter coat. But in the morning sun, he was certain he saw the faded trace of something man-made. A freeze brand. Ethan exhaled, a heaviness settling in his chest. A freeze brand, used by sanctuaries or holding facilities to mark horses that had once passed through human hands. Which meant Maple wasn't entirely wild. Or at least she hadn't always been free. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone and snapped a few quick photos of the mark. Hours later, with Oakley dozing and Maple still unmoving at her post, Ethan stepped into the small supply room behind the cabin, where they kept medical kits, wildlife records, and an aging desktop computer used for federal database access. The screen blinked slowly to life with a long beep. Ethan navigated to the shared registry of the Bureau of Land Management and Federal Mustang ID Center. He typed in the freeze brand code. His heart raced as he waited. Then, one result appeared. Record ID 2875M, name Marlowe, assigned at age 1.5. Color, dark bay with black mane. Sex, female, birthplace, High Desert Preserve, Nevada. Status, adopted 2013, returned after owner convicted of animal cruelty. Current classification, missing, presumed dead or escaped during herd relocation 2015. Ethan slumped into the chair, hands falling limp at his sides. Maple, her real name was Marlowe. She wasn't just a wild horse, she was a survivor. Of cages, of broken systems, of betrayal at the hands of humans. And now, she stood outside a barn, guarding her fragile child's sleep with eyes that had once stared into hell. Ethan printed the record. Each word weighed heavy in his palm. He returned to the barn. Maple was still there, unmoving, unfazed. Ethan didn't approach. He sat down in the dirt a few yards away, laid the papers in front of him, and spoke softly. "I know who you are now." Maple didn't shift, but her ears twitched. "You were captured, weren't you? Believed in humans once, and got hurt so badly, you ran. You vanished." No reply, but her eyes, dark and fathomless, seemed to deepen. "I didn't recognize you at first, but maybe you recognized me." Ethan lowered his voice as if confessing something sacred. "I used to work with machines, steel, systems that ran with the precision of math, but no system could measure what I see in you." He looked up. The wind tugged at his hair. Maple didn't blink. "You stand there. You stayed. You gave your child to a stranger, even after what people did to you." Silence lingered. Then Ethan spoke again, even softer, like handling something too delicate to hold. "You didn't just save Oakley. You're teaching me what trust really means." For the first time, Maple lowered her head, reaching toward the space between them, close enough for Ethan to feel her breath warm against his cheek, heavy, damp, like an unspoken answer. He lifted his hand but didn't touch her. He simply offered it, open like that first moment in the woods. And then, something small but profound. Maple placed her muzzle gently onto the back of his hand. Not submission, recognition. The midday sun scorched down on Rock Pine Sanctuary, thickening the air like a heat-laden curtain. Maple stood silently by Oakley's stall, calm in posture, but her ears flicked at every unfamiliar sound echoing from the dirt road that led into the facility. Ethan felt it coming, like a storm without thunderclouds. The morning had unfolded routinely. He fed Oakley, emptied bins, checked the water system. But since opening his email and seeing the subject line, notification of freeze brand verification USFWS, his gut hadn't settled. He clicked it open. A short, sterile paragraph strung together with statutes and numbers. The message was clear. A federal inspection team would arrive at Rock Pines within 24 hours to verify the custody of a Mustang with a recorded freeze brand. Ethan sat still in the small office, staring at the words. But his ears could almost hear Maple's hooves shifting outside, alert and ready. Did she know? Could she feel something shifting? That afternoon, he said nothing to Lily or Wade. He quietly refreshed the water buckets, tidied the barn, and sat with Maple for over an hour. By sunset, with golden light filtering through the tall pines, he had made his decision. If they wanted to take her, they'd have to go through him. The next morning at 10:17 a.m., a black SUV rolled through the front gate. The engine was quiet, but the crunch of tires over gravel made Maple lift her head sharply. Ethan was already outside, arms folded across his chest. Lily stood a pace behind him. Wade leaned in the doorway, hunched but razor-eyed. Inside the stall, Oakley slept beneath straw and soft blankets. 3 people stepped out, 2 men, 1 woman. The woman wore a deep navy blazer, hair pulled tight in a bun, her expression the familiar mask of federal detachment. The men wore USFWS emblems on their belts. "You're Ethan Calloway?" she asked flatly, no greeting. "I am," he replied, voice level. "We received notice of a Mustang with a freeze brand on this property. Under federal code, such animals are government property unless officially transferred. We're here to assess the situation." "She's not confined," Ethan said, gesturing toward Maple, who stood about 30 feet away, her eyes locked onto them as if she understood every word. "She came here on her own. She chose to stay." The woman narrowed her eyes. "Wild Mustangs don't make choices, Mr. Calloway. They act on instinct." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You're wrong." One of the men glanced toward Maple. "I don't know. Look at her. She's guarding? That's not normal behavior." "We need to see the mare and the foal," the woman said firmly. "Fine," Ethan nodded, "but I'm telling you, if you try to touch either of them, it won't end well." They stepped into the barn. Immediately Maple moved forward, blocking their path. No kicking, no charging, just a living wall between her baby and the world. "She's in the way," the woman said curtly. "No," Ethan said softly. "She's doing the only thing she knows, protecting her family." The younger male agent lifted a foot to take a step, and Maple slammed a front hoof onto the wooden floor, loud and sharp as a gunshot in silence. Her eyes flared. Her mane bristled, but she didn't strike. It was a warning. The agent froze. I think we should be careful." The woman snapped, "Get the photos. Gather the data. Do not touch them." Ethan stood back, breathing deep. Only when the agents exited did Maple retreat, inch by inch, never breaking eye contact. The woman turned to him. "We'll submit the report, but let me remind you, if the data confirms this horse is federal property, you have no legal right to retain her. Enforcement can be enacted within 72 hours. "She's not property," Ethan said, voice steady. "And if someone tries to rip her away from her recovering child, I swear, I'll make sure the whole world hears about it." "The world doesn't decide the law, Mr. Calloway." "No," Ethan said quietly, "but the world decides what's just." She didn't reply, just turned and walked back to the SUV. Before getting in, the younger agent looked back once more at Maple. He said nothing, but in his eyes was something clear. "This isn't right." That evening, Ethan wrote. He wrote as if every word was breath. He uploaded a 38-second video to social media, footage of Maple trailing the pickup truck out of the forest. No halter, no lead rope, just silent, unwavering steps over red earth. He added a photo of her standing by Oakley's stall. Then posted security camera footage, Maple nudging Oakley's head gently into her chest, like a mother's embrace. His caption read, "She doesn't belong to anyone, but she chose to trust me. She was once betrayed by humans. Now not only does she trust, she forgives. She saved her child. Now it's my turn to save her. Help me protect this miracle. Let her stay, Maple and Oakley." 2 hours later, the post had 25,000 shares. By hour 8, it surpassed 100,000. Clips of Maple spread across platforms. Local news outlets reached out. Animal advocacy groups launched petitions. And that night, Ethan sat alone in his office, eyes glued to the screen, while outside, under the crescent moon, Maple stood in the exact same spot, still, watching over her sleeping child. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing he did know for certain. He would not let anyone, no matter what badge or law they held, tear apart something this sacred. Mornings at Rock Pines usually began in a hush, the kind of silence that belonged to forests. Sunlight struggling to slip past fog, a woodpecker tapping faintly on ancient bark, the scent of pine hanging in the still air. But today, silence was nowhere to be found. In front of the sanctuary gates, more than 30 people had gathered. Some held handmade signs that read, "Let her stay." Others wore cowboy hats or school uniforms. A few carried cameras and microphones. The familiar black SUV returned at 9:05 a.m. But this time, it wasn't the only vehicle in sight. Parked behind it were a KXRO news van, a local radio truck, and a fleet of dust-covered pickups that spoke of Oregon's rugged mountain folk. Some were Ethan's longtime neighbors. Some were members of wildlife rescue groups. Many were strangers who had driven hours, brought together by one thing: they'd read Maple and Oakley's story, and they believed. Ethan hadn't slept. Under the weak light of the office lamp, he had spent the night replying to hundreds of messages. People moved, outraged, ready to help. He didn't know if it would change anything, but when he opened the door that morning and saw his little sanctuary surrounded by support, he knew he wasn't alone. The woman in the navy blazer, now with darker circles under her eyes, stepped out of the SUV, flanked again by 2 agents. One hand gripped a manila folder, the other a vibrating phone, buzzing with non-stop notifications. Ethan stood ready at the gate. Maple lingered near Oakley's stall, eyes fixed on the crowd, not fearful, not tense, just watching, as if she knew this was about her. "We've received formal orders," the woman began, her voice clipped and cold. "The horse named Maple, federally registered as Marlowe, is classified as federal property. The retrieval order is active within 12 hours. If you do not comply voluntarily, we will proceed with enforcement." A reporter stepped forward, mic in hand. "Ma'am, are you aware that this horse followed the man who saved her of her own free will?" "Federal law does not distinguish between coerced and voluntary entry," she replied, struggling to maintain composure under the cameras. Then, a boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped through the crowd. He held up a crayon-drawn sign that said, "Don't take her away from her baby." No one laughed. No one dismissed him. He stood still, red-eyed but unshaking. Wade walked over, resting a quiet hand on his shoulder. Ethan stepped forward, gaze unwavering. "Do you see them?" he said, eyes meeting each of the agents. "No ropes, no halters. She followed me. She chose to stay. She chose life for her child." One of the agents hesitated. The other looked at Maple, then toward the stall, where Oakley now stood, trembling legs braced, eyes bright and alert. "There are thousands of Mustangs out there needing rescue," Ethan continued. "But this one? She doesn't need saving. She just needs to not be taken." The air thickened. Cameras zoomed in. The forest wind whispered through pine boughs like nature itself was holding its breath. At last, the woman spoke. "I will document the public response," she said, tone softening slightly. "But I still must file a report. I will recommend her case for permanent protective review. For now, her status remains unchanged." A wave of exhalations swept the crowd. Some clapped, others held hands over their hearts. Maple didn't understand what paperwork had just been read aloud, but she felt it. She no longer watched the crowd like a threat. She turned to the stall, brushed her muzzle along Oakley's side. And in that moment, Rock Pines wasn't just a rescue station, it was home. That afternoon, Ethan sat on the cabin's wooden steps, a cold coffee in hand. Wade chewed on a dry blade of grass beside him. "You saw it," Wade murmured, watching Maple resting in the sun. "Some things in life, the law just don't know how to name." Ethan smiled faintly, said nothing. Maple tilted her head. Oakley wobbled behind her, legs still shaky but full of wonder. He galloped a few steps, then turned and whinnied like a kid finally let out of a hospital bed. Wade looked up at the sky. "What if the feds change their minds? What do we do then?" Ethan took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and answered quietly, "Then we let the whole damn town move into the sanctuary. Better that than let her live in a world where trust isn't a choice." That night, Maple lay near the stall door. Oakley rested with his head against her shoulder. Above them, a sliver of moon floated in a deep navy sky, like a soft eye watching over them all. In his office, Ethan typed one final update. Thank you for believing. Thank you for standing beside what's right, even when it's not written in law. She chose humans, a second time, and this time she deserves to choose again. Thank you, Rock Pines. Thank you to everyone who refuses to let the sacred be bartered away. Let her stay, she chose trust. 2 months had passed since Maple had stood between her foal and the federal agents, armed with nothing but her thin frame and unyielding gaze. And somehow, in a world where laws rarely made room for emotion, she had won. Not by fighting, not by fleeing, but by trusting. After the ordeal, Ethan received a letter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But this one was different. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a demand, it was an official declaration. Maple, registered as Marlowe, and her foal, Oakley, were to be granted permanent residence at Rock Pine Sanctuary, under special protection status for self-reintegrating wildlife. The phrase self-reintegrating was bolded and italicized, as if someone in a federal office had bent a rule or finally understood something beyond the numbers. The news spread quickly. Media dubbed Maple the horse who chose to trust again. Schools sent drawings of Oakley and his mother. A children's book publisher offered to turn the story into print. But Ethan wouldn't let anyone reduce them into cheap symbols. He only did one thing. He built an open stall. No locks, no fences, no rope. Just a pinewood shelter, facing a small meadow where dawn light spilled across every morning. Above the door, he mounted a hand-carved wooden sign. Freedom needs no locks. It only needs to be chosen. Oakley recovered faster than anyone expected. From a trembling creature in a rusted cage, he had become a blur of movement across the yard, nipping at chickens, teasing the barn cats, and nearly tipping over every fresh water pail Lily filled. Whenever Oakley rolled in the mud like a child with no fear, Maple simply stood nearby, watching. Sometimes her eyes turned distant, as if still holding memories of lost years. But then Oakley would whinny back at her, and she'd answer, with a low, tender call. A mother who had learned how to breathe again. Ethan never intruded on those moments. He watched from afar or walked quietly beside Maple at dawn when the world was still hushed and only the grass whispered beneath hooves. One morning, while fixing a loose panel on the shelter roof, Ethan heard hooves behind him. He turned. Oakley was standing there, head high, tail flicking. The colt stepped forward, nuzzled Ethan's arm. Then Maple appeared. But this time, she didn't stand between them, she stood beside him. And then, after a pause so careful it felt sacred, she lowered her forehead and pressed it gently to Ethan's chest. Not firm, not forceful, just a touch, like the first breeze of spring. Enough to say, we are the same now. Ethan closed his eyes, resting his hand on her mane, not to hold, not to bind, just to be there. When she lifted her head, he didn't speak, he didn't need to. Because in that moment, he knew she wasn't a wanderer anymore. She was home. One chilly autumn afternoon, Wade walked into the office holding a thick stack of envelopes. All thank you letters, he chuckled, even a card from a class in Vermont, says for Miss Maple and baby Oakley. Ethan opened one at random. Neat handwriting. A little girl's note. I think horses love like people do. Maple reminds me of my mom. She raised me by herself too. I want to meet her one day. Ethan folded the letter. Sometimes he couldn't read past the first line. Outside the window, Maple rested in the shade of a tall aspen. Oakley chased a yellow butterfly through the grass. Peace, something that had once felt so out of reach, now lived here, so vivid, so real. Days later, a small pickup truck pulled up at the gate. A young man in a USFWS uniform stepped out, the same agent who had once faltered at Maple's stomp. Calloway, he called, smiling, holding a folder. Here to take her back again? Ethan teased. Nope, the man grinned. This time I've got something better. He handed Ethan a laminated document, Certificate of Permanent Sanctuary Residence, Rock Pine Sanctuary, name, Marlowe, Maple, breed, Mustang mare, age unknown, est 12 years. History, former adoption returned after neglect, self-released, current, permanently protected, location, Rock Pines, Oregon, status, permanent, non-removable, non-transferable, non-disputable. Ethan read each word carefully. His eyes paused at the last line, non-disputable. That evening, the sanctuary hosted a small gathering. Lily baked pumpkin bread. Wade grilled on an open fire pit. Those who had once stood with signs now returned without fanfare. They brought hay bales, carrots, quiet hellos. Oakley galloped across the clearing, his whinny echoing in the air. Maple stood on the small hill watching, still, serene. But her eyes, softer than ever. Ethan sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a warm cup of cocoa. Wade muttered, chewing on a twig. If there's a place on earth that deserves to be called home, I think it's this one. Ethan smiled. He looked out as Maple slowly descended the hill, Oakley trailing behind. She paused at the porch, didn't speak, didn't move, just stood, entirely present, no longer running. Ethan set down his cup and rose. "Good evening, girl," he said. Maple took one step closer. Then, once more, she rested her forehead against his chest. This time, he couldn't hold back the tears. "You didn't just find a home, Maple," he whispered. "You are home." And as the sun sank behind the western ridge, casting golden light over rock pines, three beings stood together. A man, a mare, and a little Mustang colt. Living proof of one simple, mighty truth. Sometimes the only thing a soul needs to heal is the freedom to choose. If you believe that sometimes it's the wild creatures who teach us what trust truly means, leave a 1 below. If you've ever witnessed, or felt, a wordless connection between a human and an animal, drop a 0. And if the story of Maple, Oakley, and Ethan made your heart skip a beat, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next journey that reaches deep into the soul, where freedom, love, and life are told through the eyes of those once thought lost.